On a quiet street in London, nestled behind a high iron gate, stands a house shrouded in an eerie stillness. Built in the late 1800s, the grand Victorian property has a history as dark as its weathered stone facade. When Hollywood star Robert Pattinson purchased the house, he believed it would be his sanctuary, a refuge from prying eyes. But within weeks of moving in, whispers of strange occurrences began to surface. Maggie Donovan, an American interior designer, was flown in to renovate the property. The first day she entered the house, she felt an oppressive chill that seeped into her bones despite the summer heat. Dismissing it as London's infamous damp weather, Maggie got to work. But as she placed her sketches on the oak dining table, she swore the papers shifted on their own. She froze, staring at the table, but nothing moved again. Laughing nervously, she blamed the draft from an open window. Yet when she checked, every window in the room was locked tight. Pattinson himself began noticing oddities. Lights flickered in the kitchen, despite brand-new wiring. The scent of jasmine wafted through the house, growing stronger near the grand staircase, though no flowers were ever brought in. One night, as he read in his study, a heavy thud came from the hallway. Thinking it was his assistant, Rob called out, "Jessica? Is that you?" Silence. When he stepped into the hallway, no one was there. Instead, he found the large antique mirror near the front door tilted at an unnatural angle, as if someone had slammed into it. Shivers crawled up his spine. He straightened the mirror, only to feel a freezing draft brush against his neck. Maggie, determined to get to the bottom of the disturbances, hired Daniel Moore, an American paranormal investigator known for his no-nonsense approach. "These old homes settle," he told her, placing equipment in various rooms. "It's not unusual for people to hear creaks or feel cold spots," but by the second night, Daniel looked less confident. His thermal camera captured inexplicable cold streaks darting across the hallways. The electromagnetic field reader spiked wildly near the mirror in the entryway. The most chilling discovery came when Daniel reviewed the audio recordings. Amidst the hum of the house, a voice whispered clearly, "Get out." Daniel dug deeper into the house's history. In the late 1800s, the manor had been owned by a reclusive man named Henry Alcott. Rumors swirled about his obsession with seances and contacting the dead. His wife, Clara, had died mysteriously, her body found at the bottom of the grand staircase, her face frozen in terror. That staircase was precisely where the scent of jasmine was strongest. Feeling an urgency to protect her client, Maggie pressed Robert to leave the house. "Sell it," she pleaded, but Robert was defiant. "This is just old house nonsense," he said, until the night he woke up to the sound of heavy breathing inches from his face. His bedroom door had been locked. The last straw came when Maggie was in the living room cataloging furniture. She heard a soft humming, an old, haunting melody. The sound grew louder, coming from the grand piano that had sat untouched for decades. Trembling, she approached the piano. The keys moved on their own. Maggie screamed, grabbing her phone to call Daniel. But when she looked at her reflection in the nearby mirror, a pale, faceless figure stood behind her. She fled, vowing never to return. Robert Pattinson sold the house within weeks, leaving behind everything, including the mirror. The new owners, a couple from America, claimed to love its historic charm. They laughed off the rumors until the jasmine scent returned. It said the house is alive, keeping its secrets buried within the stone walls. Those who visit claim to feel a presence watching, waiting, and restless. Some houses are never meant to be homes. Amy and Mark Hill, a young couple from Chicago, bought the house on a whim. They'd always dreamed of living abroad, and the manor's steeply discounted price seemed too good to pass up. The rumors, they thought, were just that, rumors. As they walked through the house for the first time, Amy couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were listening. The couple wasted no time settling in, turning the musty old parlor into a cozy living space. On their second night, Amy noticed something peculiar. A series of scratches on the dining room floor, long, jagged lines, as though something heavy had been dragged. She mentioned it to Mark, who shrugged it off. "Probably the movers," he said, but his voice was uneasy. Amy loved the grand piano in the corner of the drawing room. It had a timeless elegance, though several keys were chipped, and the strings inside were rusted. One rainy afternoon, she decided to clean it. As she wiped the keys, she felt a strange vibration under her fingers. The sensation stopped as quickly as it started. That night, as the couple lay in bed, a faint melody floated up the stairs, a hauntingly familiar tune. Mark sat bolt upright. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Amy nodded, her throat tight. They crept downstairs, the floorboards groaning beneath their weight. The piano lid was closed, but a single key pressed itself, producing a chilling note that reverberated through the empty room. The long hallway on the second floor was lined with old portraits, their frames gilded and their subjects solemn. Amy hated walking past them at night. Their eyes seemed to follow her, no matter where she stood. She asked Mark if they could take them down, but he hesitated. "They're part of the house's history," he said. One evening, as Amy reached the end of the hall, she noticed something that made her heart pound. A figure in one of the portraits, a severe-looking woman in a black dress, was gone. Her silhouette remained faintly outlined in dust, but the canvas was empty. She called for Mark, but by the time he arrived, the figure had returned, her eyes fixed directly on Amy. Mark began to feel the strain of the house as well. One evening, as he brushed his teeth, the mirror in the bathroom began to fog despite the room being cold. He froze as letters began to appear in the condensation. "Help me." Grabbing a towel, he wiped the mirror clean, but as he did, his reflection didn't move. It stared back at him, grinning. Amy woke up alone one night, the clock glowing 3:33 a.m. Mark wasn't in bed. The house was unnervingly silent as she tiptoed through the rooms, calling his name. She found him standing in the dining room, staring at the antique mirror near the front door. "Mark," she whispered, her voice shaking. He didn't respond. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the glass. She stepped closer, and that's when she saw it. In the reflection, Mark was surrounded by shadowy figures, their heads cocked at odd angles, their empty eyes locked on her. The next day, Amy found a hidden compartment under the floorboards in the master bedroom. Inside was a small leather journal, its pages brittle with age. The name Clara Alcott was scrawled on the first page. The entries started mundane enough descriptions of the house, her marriage, the coldness of her husband. But as the pages continued, the tone grew frantic. Clara wrote about voices from the mirror and shadows that walked in the halls. Her final entry read, "I cannot leave. Henry says they will follow us. They want me. They need me. God help us all." Amy showed the journal to Mark, but he dismissed it. "It's just an old diary," he said, though his hands trembled as he flipped through the pages. Determined to find answers, Amy explored the attic, a place they'd avoided since moving in. Among the dust and cobwebs, she discovered a small door hidden behind stacks of broken furniture. It took all her strength to pry it open. Inside was a circular room, its walls covered in symbols carved deep into the wood. In the center sat a cracked mirror, its surface clouded with an unnatural darkness. The house seemed to exhale around her, the air growing thick and suffocating. Amy stumbled backward, but before she could flee, she heard a soft, raspy voice emanating from the mirror. "You shouldn't have come. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." Amy barely slept after discovering the hidden room. The carved symbols haunted her mind, their jagged lines seeming to pulse every time she closed her eyes. She didn't tell Mark what she had found, not yet. She needed more answers. The next morning, as she sipped her coffee, Amy noticed something on the wall by the staircase. A dark smear, like soot, stretched upward, curling into shapes that resembled the symbols in the attic. She ran her hand over it, but the texture was cold and damp, like it was alive. When Mark saw her staring, he frowned. "What are you looking at?" "The mark," she said, pointing. Mark's face twisted in confusion. "Amy, there's nothing there." That night, Amy dreamed of Clara. The woman stood at the foot of the bed, her dark hair matted and her eyes wide with terror. "You need to leave," Clara whispered, her voice cracking with desperation. He's still here. He never left. Amy woke gasping, her heart pounding. But when she turned to wake Mark, she found his side of the bed empty. She called out for him, but her voice echoed through the house unanswered. Then, from somewhere downstairs, she heard faint laughter, soft, childlike, and wrong. As Amy descended the staircase, the laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, rhythmic thumping. It seemed to be coming from the basement door, a heavy wooden frame they had never opened. The key was still in the lock. Her hands trembled as she turned it, the hinges groaning as the door creaked open. A foul, earthy smell wafted up, making her gag. The stairs leading down were narrow and uneven, their wooden steps warped with age. At the bottom she found Mark. He was standing in the center of the room, staring at the far wall. Amy called his name, but he didn't move. She approached cautiously, her breath catching as she saw what he was looking at. The wall was covered in scratch marks, deep grooves carved into the stone. And then she saw the words, repeated over and over in jagged letters. "Bring her back." Mark finally spoke, his voice distant and hollow. "They won't let us leave." "What are you talking about?" Amy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "They said we took something from them. They want it back." Before Amy could respond, the air around them grew thick and oppressive. From the shadows, the faint outline of a figure emerged, its face obscured but its presence unmistakably malevolent. The cracked mirror from the attic now hung on the basement wall, and its surface shimmered as though alive. A voice echoed from within it, cold and commanding, "Give us Clara." Amy's blood ran cold. "Clara's dead," she shouted. The voice laughed, low and guttural. "Not here." Desperate to make sense of what was happening, Amy turned back to Clara's journal. As she flipped through its fragile pages, new entries began to appear, the ink forming before her eyes. The latest entry read, "They are opening the door. Time is folding in on itself. I can feel them pulling me back." Amy felt her stomach twist as a sudden realization struck her. The house wasn't just haunted. It was a trap. It didn't let go of its residents, it consumed them, weaving their lives into its endless loop of torment. But then why had Clara warned her to leave? Was there still a way out? Mark began to change. He grew withdrawn, his eyes shadowed, his skin pale. He stopped eating, spending hours staring into the mirror in the dining room. Amy caught him whispering to it one night, his voice soft and pleading. When she confronted him, he turned to her with a look she didn't recognize. "They promised to let us go if we helped them," he said. "Help them with what?" Amy demanded. Mark hesitated, his voice trembling as he finally answered. "To bring her back." The house began to shift. Doors led to rooms they had never seen before. Hallways stretched impossibly long. The scent of jasmine became suffocating, and the cold spots Amy had once ignored now burned against her skin. One night, as she stood in the attic staring at the cracked mirror, she felt a hand on her shoulder. Spinning around, she came face to face with Clara, not as a ghost, but as a living, breathing woman. "You don't understand," Clara said, her voice urgent. "They don't want me back. They want you." The house's true intentions were finally coming into focus, but it wasn't finished with Amy yet. And somewhere deep in the shadows, it was waiting. Amy staggered back, her breath caught in her throat. Clara stood before her, alive yet somehow wrong, her eyes sunken, her movements stiff, as if her very presence strained against reality. "You're lying," Amy said, though the words felt hollow. Clara stepped closer, her voice a low hiss. "Do you think you're the first? The house doesn't just haunt, it feeds. It takes what it needs, twisting time and space until no one knows what's real anymore." Amy's mind raced. The distorted hallways, the shifting rooms, the eerie sense of déjà vu. Everything Clara said made horrifying sense. "Then why are you here? Why warn me?" Clara hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the floor. "Because it's not done with me either." Downstairs, Mark's behavior grew more erratic. Amy found him one night standing in the dining room, his hands pressed against the antique mirror, his lips moving silently. When she called his name, he turned slowly, his expression vacant. "They've shown me the way," he said, his voice distant. "What are you talking about?" Amy demanded, grabbing his arm. Mark smiled a chilling, empty grin. "We can be free, Amy. All we have to do is finish what Clara started." When Amy pressed for details, Mark wouldn't answer. But that night, she woke to find him missing again. This time, his footprints led to the basement, and in his hand was a rusted crowbar. The sound of metal striking stone echoed through the house. Amy followed it, her flashlight trembling as she descended into the basement. There, Mark was prying up the floorboards, revealing a hidden chamber beneath. "What are you doing?" she screamed. Mark didn't look at her. "They told me it's here. What they need, what we need." Amy's stomach churned as the final plank was lifted, exposing a gaping black hole. A damp, fetid smell wafted upward, and she felt something stir in the darkness below, a presence, ancient and malevolent. Mark climbed down without hesitation, disappearing into the void. Against every instinct, Amy followed, the ladder creaking under her weight. At the bottom, they found themselves in a vast stone chamber lit by an unnatural blue glow. The walls were covered in carving symbols that mirrored those in the attic. Only now they seemed alive, pulsating with energy. In the center of the room stood an altar, and on it lay a figure shrouded in shadow. As Amy stepped closer, she realized with growing horror that the figure was Clara. Not the Clara she had met upstairs, but a younger version, her face serene and her body lifeless. Mark knelt beside the altar, his hands trembling as he reached out. "This is it," he whispered. "This is the key." The chamber began to rumble, the air vibrating with a deep, resonant hum. Amy stumbled back as a voice, low and guttural, filled the space. The circle must be complete. The voice seemed to emanate from every direction, pressing into her mind. Mark turned to Amy, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of fear and reverence. "It's not asking. It's demanding. What does it want from us?" Amy cried. Mark's gaze shifted to the altar, then back to her. "It wants you." The walls of the chamber began to shift, closing in. The carvings glowed brighter, their light now harsh and blinding. Amy could barely hear her own thoughts over the rising cacophony of whispers. Suddenly, Clara appeared again, not the lifeless body on the altar, but the Clara from the attic, her form flickering like a flame about to go out. "You can stop this," she said, her voice urgent. "But you have to choose. It's always been about the choice." Amy's mind raced. The house wanted her. But why? What did Clara mean by choice? Before she could respond, Mark stood, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Take me instead," he shouted. The whispers stopped, the chamber falling into an eerie silence. Then the voice returned, deeper and colder than before. "The offer is denied." A sudden wind tore through the chamber, extinguishing the blue glow. In the pitch darkness, Amy felt many hands grasping at her, pulling her toward the altar. She screamed, but the force was relentless. Then she remembered the journal, the cryptic warnings scrawled in Clara's desperate handwriting. "The door is the key, but which door?" As the wind grew stronger, Amy's hand brushed against something cold and metallic. A small, ornate key lay on the ground, its surface engraved with the same symbols from the attic. Without thinking, she grabbed it and turned toward the far end of the chamber, where a faint outline of a door glimmered. "Stop her!" the voice roared, and the chamber erupted into chaos. Amy sprinted toward the door, the key trembling in her grip. Behind her, Mark's voice rose in panic. "Amy, no. You don't know what's on the other side." But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The door loomed closer, and as she plunged the key into the lock, the house seemed to scream, its walls convulsing in fury. The door creaked open, revealing. Amy pushed the door open, a blinding light spilling into the chamber. She shielded her eyes, stepping forward into a vast, desolate field under a gray sky. The oppressive presence of the house was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. She turned, expecting to see Mark behind her, but the door had vanished. The house itself was gone, leaving only the field and the chilling wind that whispered her name. Amy, came a voice from nowhere and everywhere at once. She spun around, her heart pounding, and saw Clara standing a few feet away, her face serene yet sorrowful. "You've escaped," Clara said softly, "but you'll never truly leave." Before Amy could speak, the ground beneath her trembled, and the symbols from the house began to appear in the soil, glowing faintly. She realized with growing horror that she hadn't escaped at all. The house was spreading, its influence leaking into the world beyond. Months later, the field was gone, replaced by a new estate. Families moved in, unaware of the land's dark history. Late at night, neighbors reported seeing a woman standing at the edge of the property, her silhouette faint but unmistakable. And deep underground, the house waited, its whispers growing louder. It had claimed Amy, but its hunger was insatiable. It always needed more. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.